In this video, I'm going to be introducing the R interpreter. Now, I'm going to be using macOS Big Sur to demonstrate, but other than starting the actual interpreter, all the commands and descriptions in the video will actually be cross-platform. To start the interpreter, we're going to be using the R command. On Windows, you can do this by opening the command prompt, command.exe, and typing R, or rterm. In Linux and Mac, you can do the same by using the terminal, and then simply running R, as we'll demonstrate here in a moment. In the notebook here, there's a basic example showing you what starting the R interpreter would look like in the terminal. Also, I want to point out here that in all examples moving forward, we're going to be using the $sign character to represent the prompt in the terminal, and we're going to be using the greater than symbol or the right arrow character to represent the prompt in the R console or R terminal. So let's try starting the R interpreter now. I'm going to switch over to a terminal, and at the prompt, we simply type R and hit enter. And as we see here, it outputs very similar information to what was in the notebook. In the text here, we see several functions we can run right off the bat, one of which is the license function. And this will output the license under which this distribution has been released. And so to view that, we'll simply type license, open and close parentheses, and hit enter. And we see the license text is output here. The next function is the contributors function. If we type contributors, open and close parentheses, and hit enter, we'll see a description of the R project, including a brief history and a listing of those responsible for the project itself. For those of you using R code in your publications, there's a citation function that will return the text needed to properly cite R, as well as a BibTeX entry for those of you who are using LaTeX. Also, the citation function can give you the appropriate text needed to cite various R packages that you may be using as well. The next two functions, demo and help, we're not going to be covering here. I do encourage you to check out the demo function on your own, and the help function will be covered in many of the videos to come. And in each of the notebooks, we'll have references to the help section that include the exact help command needed to find that help documentation. As an aside, the precompiled binary distribution of R does contain an application called the R console, which is sometimes labeled just R or R GUI in Windows, that gives sort of a graphical interface on top of the R interpreter. So we've been using the terminal to run the R interpreter. However, the R console can provide a somewhat nicer interface for writing and running R code. Okay, let's switch back to a terminal now. And I want to show you one more function, the Q function or quit function. And so if we type Q, open and close parentheses, and hit enter, this will quit the interpreter. However, before doing so, it's going to ask us whether or not we want to save our workspace image. For right now, I'm going to hit N for no, and I'll come back to what this is doing in just a moment. In R, the concept of a working directory is actually important, as the interpreter will use this location as its point of reference for loading and saving files, including the workspace image that we were given the option of saving when exiting the interpreter in the previous example. When invoking the interpreter, the working directory is initially set to the directory from which the interpreter was invoked. So in the terminal here, I am currently in my home directory, and I will create a subdirectory named work. I'm then going to start the R interpreter from my home directory, and using the get working directory or get WD function, I can actually check what R is currently using for the working directory. And we see here that it's my home directory where I invoke the R interpreter. Now I can change the working directory in R using the set working directory or set WD function. So I'm going to type set WD, and then in parentheses, I'm going to put open quote, the path to the work directory we just created, close quote, close parentheses. And after I hit enter here, I'm going to verify that R has updated the working directory to the work folder by calling get WD again, and we see that it has. I can actually view the contents of this directory as well using the directory function or dir function. If I type dir, open and close parentheses, the function returns an empty character list indicating that there's nothing in the directory, which makes sense because we just created this directory and we haven't put anything in it yet. Now, don't worry if you don't understand the character 0. We'll talk more about that in a later notebook. So before we quit the interpreter and take a look at the workspace files, I want to point out that the interpreter does save a history of the commands that you enter. So you can scroll through this history using the up and down arrows. So if I press the up arrow, you see all the previously entered commands up to the point where we started the session. And if I hit down, you can of course cycle back through them again. Actually, the interpreter does allow us to use the left and right arrows as well, not for the history, but to instead say correct a typo. If I type getwd and I accidentally put an extra T in there, I can simply move the cursor back over, use the backspace or maybe the delete key to remove the T without actually having to retype the entire command. In fact, the interpreter supports tab completion and a lot of the niceties that come with the standard terminal. Okay, so let's now quit the interpreter. And this time I'm going to save the workspace to the current working directory. The workspace generally includes two files, an rdata file and an rhistory file. We'll come back to the rdata file, but the history file contains the history of commands executed in the interpreter. We've already seen that we can scroll back through these commands while in the interpreter, but if we change to our work directory here, and I list the hidden files, we see now that there's an .rhistory file. And if I output the contents of that file to the console, we can see that it contains all the commands that were executed in the order that they were executed in the last session. This is actually one of the reasons why it's recommended that you create separate directories for each of your R sessions or projects, because by doing so, you really keep a record of the exact steps taken to create a particular result or perform some analysis. It's sort of a self-documenting feature. Now, we said the interpreter would also create an rdata file, but when we listed the contents of the directory, we didn't see that file. So this is because our last session, we actually didn't have any data to save. So right now we're going to create some data. I'm going to start the R interpreter again from our work directory that we created, where we previously saved our workspace. This time when it starts, we see something slightly different. It states that the previous workspace has been restored. Now I'm going to come back to that. For the moment, I'm simply going to create some data and exit. I'm going to assign the integer 1 to the variable a, and then I'm going to output a and verify that it has the value 1. And we'll go over the syntax and what all these statements are really doing in later notebooks. So for now, let's just take for granted the fact that we've created the integer 1, and if we want to use it, we can use the variable a to do so. So I'm going to quit the interpreter again, and I'm going to save the workspace. If I list the hidden files again, we see we have an rdata file and the rhistory as before. Now, unfortunately, the rdata file can't be trivially viewed because it's a binary data format that's actually managed by the R interpreter. But when we output the history file again, we see that instead of overwriting the history with our last session, namely the assignment of A and the output of A, it's actually been appended to the previous history. And that's because when the R interpreter starts, it loads the history or data files that are present in the working directory and actually restores the state from the last session. It's like picking up where you left off. To show you what I mean, let me start a new terminal and change to the work directory. I'm going to start the R interpreter again, and we see that it says it restored our previous workspace. If I use the up-down arrows, I can immediately scroll back through the commands run in the previous 2 sessions. And moreover, if I try to output the variable a again, as we did in the last session, it outputs 1. So it not only loads the command history, but it's also loading the state of all variables from the previous sessions using this R data file. Now this will wrap up this video, but I encourage you to try out some of the functions we went over, as well as play with the working directory to see how this feature can help you to keep your projects separate and organized.